Pakistan's economic crisis, causes and consequences. We will eat grass, even go hungry, but will have our own. These were the words of former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, referring to nuclear weapons in the 1970s. What an irony! 50 years later, this statement has become a reality for Pakistan. As today, the country has its own nuclear weapons, but at the same time, its people are going hungry due to the economic crisis the country is facing. Pakistan's economic crisis is so severe that it only has $2.9 billion in foreign reserves as of February 3, 2023, which is enough to cover only 3 weeks of imports. The crisis has forced the government to take desperate measures like selling the country's embassy property in the US for funds, asking citizens to drink less tea to save the cost of importing tea, and shutting down markets and restaurants early to save electricity. But how did Pakistan get into such a dire economic situation? Join us as we take a look at Pakistan's economic crisis and how the country is attempting to cope with it. Beginning of the crisis. The economic crisis that Pakistan is facing today is not new. It has been there for a very long period of time. Many reasons have forced Pakistan into this difficult situation. Let's talk about them one by one. Political instability. Since Pakistan gained independence in 1947, the country has had 29 prime ministers, none of whom have completed their 5-year term. 18 of these prime ministers have been removed due to corruption or military coups. The recent removal of Prime Minister Imran Khan through a vote of no confidence by Shehbaz Sharif and 7 other parties is proof of this. When the government changes, so does the financial policies and investment strategies. These frequent changes in policies have affected the country's economic growth. Government's overspending. When Imran Khan came to power in August 2018, the price for a litre of petrol was PKR 95. 2 years later, in June 2020, the price for the same was PKR 74, the cheapest in South Asia. This wasn't new. Every political party which came to power went on a spending spree to stay in power. To fund this spending, the government took on more debts, increasing the burden for the next government. This cycle has been continuing for decades. Low tax to GDP ratio. Pakistan has always struggled to tax its citizens. You will be shocked to know that only 1% of the country's population pays taxes. Moreover, the country's allies, who have significant influence over the government, often avoid paying taxes. As a result, the government has failed to generate sufficient revenue to meet its expenses, forcing it to borrow and rely on foreign aid to make up for the shortfall. To give you an idea, for the financial year 2021 to 22, country's revenue was PKR 4.49 trillion, whereas its expenditure stood at PKR 8.49 trillion. This caused a deficit of almost PKR 4 trillion to the government. Military over society. Pakistan's military is one of the most powerful institutions in the country, with the military general holding more power than the Prime Minister. There have been many instances in the past where it has used its power to overthrow the civilian government and take control of the country. It also receives a large portion of the national budget, which ranges from 18 to 23% every year, even though it has over 50 commercial entities generating a revenue of $1.5 billion annually. In 2022, when the country reduced spending on areas such as infrastructure and education, military spending increased by 11%. Terrorism. Terrorism has been a problem in Pakistan for decades and is supported by the country's military. This has deterred many foreign investors from investing in the country. Even when the country enjoyed political and economic stability, it has struggled to get foreign investment. This has further deepened its economic troubles. From crisis to calamity. However, today, the crisis has escalated into a full-blown calamity. But how did it get so worse? The credit goes to the 3 major events that took place in recent years. COVID-19 pandemic. Just months before COVID-19 hit the world, Pakistan had sought aid from the International Monetary Fund (IMF) to overcome its twin deficits in fiscal and current accounts. When the country started to make progress with IMF aid, the pandemic hit. As a result, the exports fell by 50% and the GDP dropped to minus 0.4%, resulting in the loss of 1/3 of the country's revenue. What did then Prime Minister Imran Khan do to deal with this situation? He launched the Ehsaas program, providing cash assistance to the country's low-income population, further worsening the country's financial situation. Russia-Ukraine War. Then came the Russia-Ukraine War, causing oil prices to skyrocket. The rise in oil prices compelled the government to increase subsidies to ease the burden on citizens. These subsidies came at an expense of an additional debt of $1.289 billion, which country just couldn't afford. Monsoon flood. It all got even worse when the country was hit by a devastating flood between July and September 2022. The flood not only claimed around 2,000 lives and displaced 33 million people, but also damaged the infrastructure of the country worth $40 billion. It wiped out over 8 million acres of crops, leading to a food shortage in the country. Pakistan's present situation. At present, Pakistan's total public debt stands at $279 billion, which is about 74% of the country's GDP of $376 billion. This has caused the country's 40% to 50% of revenue to be allocated towards debt repayments. Adding to the problem is the huge gap between the country's imports and exports. While exports are valued at $30 billion, imports are over $70 billion. This excess of imports over exports has resulted in trade deficit, causing the country's forex reserve to fall to just $2.9 billion as of February 3, 2023, which is barely enough to cover 3 weeks of the nation's imports. But what is forex reserve? It is the foreign currency held by the country's central bank. This acts as the backup if the national currency falls or becomes insolvent. Due to this shortage, thousands of containers of food items, raw materials, and medical equipment are held up at ports. The recent flood, along with inflation of 27.55%, resulted in a major food crisis, causing the prices of basic food items like flour to skyrocket to PKR 1,500 for 10 kilograms, which is 3 times the usual rate. Rice, pulses, and salt prices have also increased by 50%, and the price of onions has risen by 501% in just 1 year. Besides soaring prices, the country is facing a power outage affecting the working of factories, hospitals, and schools. There is also fear that the country might run out of fuel soon. Inflation, which is at its highest level in 48 years, has reduced the buying power of the country's currency against foreign currencies. The Pakistani rupee has fallen against the dollar from PKR 176 to PKR 275.24 on February 3, 2023. Compared to 1 Indian rupee, the PKR has fallen from 2.35 to 3.35 in just 1 year. What lies ahead for Pakistan? When a country has a low foreign exchange reserve, they tend to make an appeal to the IMF for a relief package. The IMF grants relief to the country based on the quota system. Even Pakistan has received relief funds based on its quota 23 times from 1958 till now. In 2019, when the country received a bailout of $6 billion from the IMF and an additional $1 billion in August 2022, it set 28 conditions to grant aid. However, the country failed to fulfill 16 of these conditions, including the core condition of increasing the foreign exchange reserves. The government feared that fulfilling these conditions would mean more inflation that would be difficult to control. Now, when the country approached the IMF for a new relief package, the organization set much more stringent and rigorous conditions for providing funds. Despite not being happy with the conditions, the country accepted them. To comply with it, the country lifted the artificial cap on its currency, causing the Pakistani rupee to fall by 20% against the dollars in just a few days. Additionally, the government raised fuel prices by 16% and interest rates by 100 basis points. Even austerity measures have been adopted by the government. To tell you about austerity measures, these are the economic policies implemented by the government when the country's debt becomes so large that it increases the risk of default. The measures adopted by Pakistan government includes reducing the size of cabinet, 15% cut in the salary and allowance of the ministers, withdrawal of perks of retired civil servants, 15% cut in the current budget of all ministries and departments, and many more. Aside from the IMF, the country also approached several other organizations and allies for financial assistance. These organizations and allies, including China, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, have provided Pakistan with more than $10 billion in aid. Over the years, the country has been heavily dependent on loans from these allies to keep its economy afloat. However, even these countries are running out of patience and are demanding to see serious improvement in the country's economy. Of all the allies, China is the largest lender, with the loan of $30 billion, which accounts for over 30% of the country's total foreign debt, 3 times what Pakistan owes to the IMF. These loans have unclear terms and interest rates that are 1 to 2 percentage points higher than those offered by other countries and lenders. This has raised concerns about the country falling into a Chinese debt trap like Sri Lanka, where China takes control of the assets of the country if it fails to repay its debt. Conclusion: the country's deteriorating economy and increased borrowing have led it into a debt trap where it takes on more debt to pay off its existing debt. To come out of its vicious debt cycle, it will need to restructure its economy by decreasing its reliance on foreign aid and generating more internal sources of revenue. It also needs to establish a political environment free from corruption and military interference. And last but not the least, it should avoid prioritizing military development over the well-being of its citizens. As for now, the future of Pakistan's economy remains uncertain as the country continues to wait for the IMF bailout. If you enjoyed watching this video, then make sure to subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos like this. And if you have any feedback or comments, leave them below. Your feedback helps us to create better content for you. Thanks for watching.